My name is Renee Castillo, and I was 34 years old the Thanksgiving my mother stood up at the head of her own dining table, in front of 11 family members and a turkey nobody had started eating yet, and screamed that I was a burden. Not in an argument that had been building all afternoon. Not after I'd said something cutting or unkind. I had asked, gently, whether she'd taken her evening medication, because I had been managing her medication schedule for 14 months by that point, ever since her heart failure diagnosis had made it unsafe for her to manage it alone. That was the whole provocation. A medication question, asked quietly, across a table full of green beans and my aunt's sweet potato casserole. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood. She said, loud enough that my uncle's hearing aid practically rang with it, that she was sick and tired of being treated like an invalid in her own house, that I hovered, that I made her feel like a problem to be managed instead of a mother, and that, this is the part that has lived in my chest ever since, the part one can still hear at 3 in the morning. She said I had become nothing but a burden to everyone who had to be around me. I had given up my apartment 8 months earlier to move into her guest room, so I could be there for the overnight medication checks and the slow walks to the bathroom and the 2 a.m. trips to the emergency room when her heart did the thing the cardiologist had warned us it might do. I had taken a pay cut to switch to a job with hours that let me drive her to appointments. I had done all of it quietly, the way I do most things, because I loved my mother and because that is simply what you do. And in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress, she called me the burden. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. If you have ever given everything to someone and been called the problem for giving it, stay with me. This is part one of a two-part story, and I am going to tell you exactly what happened at that table, what happened in the weeks after, and what my father did 6 weeks later that none of us saw coming. I should tell you who my mother was before that Thanksgiving, because the woman who screamed across that table was not, in any simple sense, a cruel woman. She was a complicated one, which is harder to hold and harder to forgive and, I have come to believe, more honest than any simple villain would have been. My mother, Adelina Castillo, had raised my younger brother Mateo and me largely on her own after my father, Hector, took an early retirement package from his factory job and slid, slowly, into a kind of quiet depression that made him present in the house, but absent from almost everything that mattered in it. My mother had been the one who showed up, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every late-night fever, and she had built her entire identity around being capable, around being the one who did not need help, around a fierce, almost militant self-sufficiency that I had admired my whole life and would come to understand, much later, as its own kind of wound. She was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 14 months before that Thanksgiving. It came on faster than anyone expected, a routine checkup that became an emergency room visit that became a cardiologist's careful, sober explanation of ejection fraction percentages and medication regimens, and the specific, frightening instruction that someone needed to be nearby, especially at night, in case her heart did something sudden. My brother Mateo lived 4 states away, with a demanding job and 2 young kids of his own. He offered, in the way people offer things they have already calculated they cannot actually provide, to help however he could from a distance. My father, despite living in the house, had never in 38 years of marriage managed a medication schedule, a doctor's appointment, or much of anything requiring sustained daily attention, and nobody in the family seriously proposed that he start now. So I moved in. I was 33, single, renting a 1-bedroom across town, working a job I liked in marketing for a mid-sized retailer. I gave notice on my lease, negotiated a transfer to a role with more flexible hours and a meaningful pay cut, and moved into the guest room of the house I'd grown up in to keep my mother alive. I did not resent it. I want to be completely honest about that because the story that follows is not one where I am secretly furious about the sacrifice and finally snap. I loved my mother. I would have done it again. What broke something in me was not the sacrifice itself. It was what she said about it, in front of everyone, as though the sacrifice had been an insult to her rather than an act of love. I want to walk you through what those 14 months actually looked like, because the texture of caregiving is something people who haven't done it tend to imagine in soft focus. A daughter bringing soup, a grateful mother, a warm montage. It is rarely that. It is granular and exhausting and full of small indignities that nobody photographs for greeting cards. It was a pill organizer with 7 compartments that I refilled every Sunday night, cross-referencing 4 different prescriptions against a schedule the cardiologist had given us, because getting the timing wrong on a diuretic could mean a 3 a.m. trip to the bathroom that put dangerous strain on a weakened heart, or worse, getting it wrong on a blood thinner. It was learning to recognize the specific shade of gray her face turned when her blood pressure dropped too fast, before she felt it herself. It was 3 emergency room visits in 14 months, 2 of them after midnight, sitting in fluorescent-lit waiting rooms doing the math on whether this was the night. It was also the small, grinding loss of my own life happening in the background while I managed hers. I stopped seeing the friends who lived across town because I couldn't leave overnight. I ended a relationship with a man named Diego, gently and without drama, because he was honest with me that he didn't see himself signing up for the life I was currently living, and I respected the honesty even as it cost me something. I watched my coworkers get promoted into roles I had been on track for before I requested the schedule accommodation that effectively took me out of consideration. None of this is meant as a tally of martyrdom. I am telling you because I want you to understand what was actually inside the silence my mother accused me of weaponizing against her in front of everyone on Thanksgiving. The silence was not resentment held in reserve to be deployed cruelly. It was simply the only way I knew how to do something this large, quietly, completely, without making a show of what it cost me, because making a show of it had never been the language my family spoke. My father, meanwhile, continued largely as he had for years. He went to his Tuesday card game. He watched television in the evenings. He loved my mother. I believe that completely, but love in him had long ago calcified into a kind of passive presence rather than active participation, and nobody in the family had ever successfully asked him to be anything different, including, I now understand, my mother herself, who had built her entire self-concept around not needing the help she had never actually tried to request from him. I want to be honest that the months leading up to Thanksgiving had not been peaceful. My mother's pride, the same fierce self-sufficiency that had raised 2 children largely alone, did not adapt easily to needing daily help, and that friction had been building in small ways for months before it finally erupted at that table. She resented the medication reminders even as she needed them, in the specific way people resent the thing that keeps them alive while also reminding them they can no longer trust their own body to do it without help. She would sometimes accuse me of hovering when I checked whether she'd taken her morning dose. She would sometimes, in moments of frustration about her own diminished independence, redirect that frustration at the nearest available target, which was almost always me, because I was the one who was there. I understood this, intellectually, even as it wore on me. Caregivers are told constantly that the person they're caring for isn't really angry at them, that the anger is displaced fear and grief about losing independence and facing mortality. That framework is true, and also, I have learned, deeply insufficient when you are the one absorbing the anger every single day with no outlet of your own. I had mentioned to my Aunt Carmen, my mother's older sister, a few weeks before Thanksgiving, that things had been tense at home, that my mother seemed to be struggling with accepting help even as she needed more of it. Carmen had listened sympathetically and said the thing well-meaning relatives often say in these situations, that my mother had always been proud, that this was hard for everyone, that I should try to be patient because she was scared underneath the irritability. I was trying to be patient. I had been trying to be patient for 14 months. What I did not expect was that the patience would be repaid, at a table full of family on a holiday meant for gratitude, with a public accusation that the patience itself was the problem. Thanksgiving was at my parents' house, the way it always was, with my mother's siblings and their families filling every chair around a table that had been extended with 2 folding card tables to accommodate everyone. My mother had insisted on hosting despite the heart failure, despite my gentle suggestion that we could do something smaller this year, because hosting was, I understand now, one of the last remaining ways she had to prove to herself and everyone else that she was still capable, still in charge, still herself. She had overdone it. I could see it by mid-afternoon. The particular gray tint to her color, the way she sat down between tasks more than she used to, the slight breathlessness when she crossed the kitchen. I had been quietly tracking her medication timing all day because the evening dose of her diuretic needed to happen before dinner got too far along, and I knew from experience that letting it slip even an hour could mean a difficult night. I asked her, leaning toward her chair as everyone was settling in to eat, whether she had taken her evening pills. I kept my voice low. I was not performing concern for the table. I was managing a medical schedule the way I had managed it 300 times before. She stood up. The chair scraped. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something is about to happen that everyone will remember. She said, loud enough for every person at every table to hear, that she was sick of being treated like an invalid in her own house. She said I hovered over her like she was already dead. She said, and this is where her voice cracked into something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something I've spent months trying to name, that I had taken over her life and made her feel like nothing but a burden, and that the worst part was that I had become the same thing to everyone around me, hovering and managing and making everyone uncomfortable with how much I'd given up, until being around me felt like being managed instead of loved. She called me the burden. In a house I had moved into to keep her alive. At a table I had helped set with medication timing built into the seating chart. In front of every person whose opinion of me she had spent her whole life caring about. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. My Aunt Carmen's fork was frozen halfway to her mouth. My father stared at his plate. Mateo, home for the holiday with his wife and kids, looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, and didn't try to. I did not cry at the table. I want that on the record, because everything in me wanted to, and some old, deep instinct about not making scenes in my mother's house held the tears exactly where they were until I could be somewhere private. I said, quietly, that I was sorry she felt that way, and I excused myself, and I drove to my old apartment building's parking lot. Not even inside, just the parking lot, because it was the only place that still felt like it belonged to no one's expectations but my own. And I sat in my car for 2 hours and cried in a way I had not let myself cry in 14 months. I did not move back into the guest room that night. I want to be clear about what that decision was and was not. It was not abandonment. I called Mateo before he flew home and asked him, directly, to arrange a home health aide for the overnight hours at minimum, until I figured out what came next. I called my mother's cardiologist's office the following Monday and asked about home health resources, because whatever had happened at that table, my mother's heart had not stopped needing careful management, and I was not willing to let my own devastation become a danger to her safety. But I was not willing, either, to walk back into that house as though nothing had been said. 14 months of quiet sacrifice had just been publicly redefined by the person I had sacrificed for as a burden inflicted on her rather than a gift given to her. I needed to understand what that meant before I could decide what I owed her going forward, and I could not understand it from inside the guest room. I stayed with Aunt Carmen for the first week. She did not ask me to explain myself, which I was grateful for, though she did say one thing on the second night that I have carried with me since. She said, "Renee, I have watched your mother my whole life decide that needing help is the same thing as being weak. I think what she said to you on Thursday was about her, not about you. That doesn't make it okay to say. It just means you shouldn't spend the next month trying to figure out what you did wrong, because I don't think you did anything wrong at all." My mother did not call me for 9 days. I did not call her either. This was, I think, the longest period of silence between us in my entire adult life, and it sat in my chest like a stone the whole time. Not because I doubted my decision to step back, but because 34 years of being her daughter had never included a silence this total, and some part of me kept waiting for the phone to ring with an apology that never came. What came instead, on the 10th day, was a call from my father. I had not heard my father initiate a phone call to me in longer than I could remember. Hector Castillo was not a man who called people. He was a man who was present in rooms and absent from conversations, who loved in the passive tense, who had let 38 years of marriage and 2 children grow up around him without ever quite stepping fully into the center of any of it. When I saw his name on my phone, I almost didn't answer, because some part of me assumed it would be a message relayed on my mother's behalf, another version of the family's long habit of asking me to absorb things quietly for the sake of peace. I was wrong about what he wanted. I would understand, 6 weeks later, exactly how wrong. But what my father actually said on that call, and what happened in the 6 weeks after it that none of us, including him, saw coming, is where I have to leave part 1. If you've ever given everything to someone and been called the problem for giving it, I want you to know this much before we get to part 2. What happened next did not happen because my mother apologized. It happened because my father, of all people, finally did something none of us had ever seen him do. Subscribe so you don't miss part 2, where I'll tell you exactly what my father said, what my mother did 6 weeks later, and why, by the end of it, I finally understood the difference between being needed and being used. My name is Renee Castillo, and if you watched part 1, you know where we left off. 9 days of silence after my mother screamed across a Thanksgiving table that I was a burden. After 14 months of medication schedules and 2 a.m. emergency room visits, and a life I had quietly folded up and put away to keep her alive. 9 days of nothing. And then on the 10th day, my phone rang with a name on the screen I almost never saw calling me at all. My father. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, I'd go back and start there because what happens in this video will land differently if you don't know what came before it. For everyone else, let's finish this. I answered on the 3rd ring, bracing myself for a message relayed on my mother's behalf, the way so many things in my family had always traveled, never directly, always through someone, so that nobody had to fully own what they were asking for. My father's voice, when it came, was not the voice I expected. It was unsteady in a way I had never heard from him, not even at his own father's funeral 15 years earlier, where he had stood at the podium and read a eulogy in the flat, controlled register of a man who had learned long ago that showing too much was its own kind of failure. He said, "Renee, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I sat down on the edge of Aunt Carmen's guest bed and said okay. What followed was the longest thing I had ever heard my father say in one continuous breath. He told me that the home health aide Mateo had arranged had quit after 4 days, citing my mother's refusal to accept help with even the most basic tasks, refusing to let the aide assist with bathing, refusing the reminder system for medications, insisting she could manage on her own. He told me that on the 7th night, alone in the house with my mother for the first time in 14 months without me there to manage the schedule, he had woken at 1 a.m. to find her on the bathroom floor, having taken her diuretic 4 hours late and then stood up too fast, her blood pressure cratering exactly the way the cardiologist had warned us it could. He told me he had not known what medication she had or hadn't taken because he had never once, in 14 months, asked. He told me he had called 911 with his hands shaking so badly he had to set the phone down on the bathroom counter to dial. He told me the ER doctor had asked him a series of basic questions about her medications and her baseline symptoms that he could not answer, and that the specific, particular humiliation of standing in a hospital hallway unable to answer basic questions about his own wife's care had done something to him that nothing else in 38 years of marriage had managed to do. He said, "Renee, I have spent my whole life letting other people carry things, so I didn't have to learn how. I let your mother carry the kids. I let her carry the house. And when she got sick, I let you carry her." I told myself I was respecting her independence and respecting how capable you are, but that's not what I was doing. I was doing what I've always done. I was disappearing. He was crying. I had seen my father cry exactly twice before in my life. Once at his own mother's funeral, once at my college graduation. This was the 3rd time, and it was the first time I had ever heard him name, out loud, the thing every member of our family had quietly organized our lives around not naming. He did not ask me to move back in. I want to be precise about that because it would have been the easiest thing in the world for him to ask, and it was not what he asked. He said, "I'm not calling to ask you to come fix this the way you've fixed everything else. I'm calling because I need you to teach me. I need to learn the medication schedule. I need to learn what her color looks like when something's wrong before she knows it herself. I need to learn how to be the person in that house who can answer the doctor's questions, because it should never have taken her on a bathroom floor at 1 a.m. for me to understand that I'd let you become the only person in this family who knew how to keep her alive." I did not answer right away. I sat on Aunt Carmen's guest bed with the phone against my ear and felt something complicated move through me, relief and grief, and a kind of vindication that did not feel as satisfying as I had expected vindication to feel, because underneath all of it was the simple, exhausting recognition that my father was finally asking the question that should have been asked 14 months earlier, and that the asking had cost my mother a night on a bathroom floor to arrive. I told him I would help him learn. I told him I would not move back into the guest room, not yet, not until I understood what had actually changed and what hadn't. I told him that what I needed from him was not gratitude or apology on my mother's behalf, but action, concrete, specific, sustained action, starting that week. He agreed to all of it without negotiating a single point, which was, in itself, more unlike my father than almost anything else that had happened. What followed were 6 weeks unlike any I had experienced with my father in 34 years of being his daughter. I drove over twice a week, not to manage anything myself, but to teach. I walked him through the pill organizer, the cross-referencing logic of which medication interacted with which, the specific timing windows that mattered, and the ones that had more flexibility. I taught him to recognize the gray tint in her face that preceded a blood pressure drop, the particular quality of breathlessness that meant call the cardiologist's after-hours line versus the kind that meant call 911 immediately. I gave him the laminated card I had made for myself 14 months earlier, the one with every medication, every dosage, every emergency contact, and watched him read it like it was the first time he had ever held information that mattered this much. He was, to his enormous credit, a diligent student. He set alarms on his phone. He asked questions I had never once heard him ask about anything, clarifying questions, follow-up questions, the questions of someone who has finally understood that not knowing is no longer an acceptable place to stand. He attended the next cardiology appointment himself, sitting in the chair I had occupied for 14 months, and called me afterward to relay, almost verbatim, what the doctor had said because he wanted to make sure he had understood it correctly. My mother, during these 6 weeks, said very little to me directly. We spoke occasionally, brief and careful conversations that circled the actual subject without ever landing on it. I did not push. I had learned, somewhere in the 9 days of silence and the phone call that broke it, that I was no longer willing to be the one who absorbed the discomfort of an unresolved conversation just to make it resolve faster. If my mother wanted to address what she had said at that table, she would have to be the one to bring it there. She brought it there in the 5th week, on a Sunday afternoon, when my father had gone to his card game for the first time in 6 weeks, a small, deliberate signal, I think, that he trusted himself to leave her alone for a few hours, and an even more deliberate signal that he had told her so directly. I had come by to drop off a refilled prescription, planning to leave it on the counter and go, the way I had been doing for weeks. She asked me to sit down. My mother is not a woman who apologizes easily. I want to set that expectation honestly because what she said to me that Sunday was not a tearful, complete reckoning. It was halting and partial, and came wrapped in justifications she could not quite let go of even as she was trying to say something true. She said, "You the way I have never needed anyone the one who doesn't need anyone. It felt like proof that everything I built myself into was a lie. And when I got sick and I needed, you were the one standing in front of me when I couldn't stand the truth about myself." She said, "That doesn't make what I said at that table okay. I have thought about your face when I said it almost every day since. I called you a burden in front of everyone I have ever wanted to think well of me, and you had given up your whole life to keep me alive. There is no version of that that isn't cruel. I was cruel to you because I couldn't be honest with myself, and I am sorry, and I understand if sorry doesn't fix 14 months and one terrible night at a table." I did not cry, though I came close. I told her that I forgave her, which was true, and that forgiveness was not the same thing as forgetting, which was also true, and that I needed some things to be different going forward if I was going to be in that house in the way I had been before. I told her I needed her to let your father do the things he is finally learning to do, even when he does them slower or differently than I would have. I told her I needed the home health aide reinstated for at least the overnight hours, not as a replacement for family, but as a baseline of safety that did not depend entirely on any one person's exhaustion. I told her that I would help, that I loved her, that I would always show up, but that I would not move back into that guest room as the only person managing her survival, because that arrangement, however lovingly intended, had nearly cost me everything it had been quietly extracting for 14 months, and had nearly cost her her life the 1 week it was suddenly absent. She agreed to all of it. I do not know, Even now, how much of that agreement came from genuine understanding and how much came from fear after the bathroom floor? And I have decided that the distinction matters less than I once thought it would, because the actions that followed were real regardless of which fear produced them. Here is what our family looks like now, for months after that Thanksgiving. My father manages the daily medication schedule. He has not missed a dose, has not missed a cardiology appointment, has learned to recognize the early signs of trouble well enough that he caught a concerning shift in her breathing 2 weeks ago and got her to urgent care before it became an emergency room visit at all. He still goes to his Tuesday card game. He has also, for the first time in 38 years of marriage, become someone his wife can actually depend on for something that matters, rather than someone who is simply present in the house while someone else carries the weight. A home health aide comes for overnight hours 4 nights a week, paid for jointly by my parents and Mateo, who finally understood, once the full shape of what had been happening became clear to him, that financial contribution from 4 states away was not the same thing as presence, but that it was something real he could actually offer, and he began offering it without being asked. I moved back into my own apartment 6 weeks after that Thanksgiving. Not the same one, a new one, smaller, in a part of town closer to my parents, but unmistakably mine. I visit twice a week the way a daughter visits, rather than the way a live-in caregiver manages. I have started seeing a man named Joaquin, slowly, carefully, the way you start things after you've spent 14 months with no room in your life for anything except someone else's survival. I have not been promoted back into the track I lost, but I have rebuilt enough of my career that I no longer feel like I am watching it from the outside. My mother and I are not exactly what we were before the diagnosis. I do not think we can be, and I have made a kind of peace with that. What we are now is more honest, which is not the same as easier, but which I have come to believe is worth considerably more. I think about that Thanksgiving table often. The chair scraping back, the silence after, the specific cruelty of the word burden landing in a room full of people whose good opinion she had spent her whole life trying to keep. I do not think she meant, in any calculated way, to destroy something between us. I think she was a frightened, proud woman watching her own body fail her in front of her family, and I happened to be standing closest when the fear came out as fury. That explanation does not erase what she said. It simply sits alongside it, the way complicated truths about people you love always have to sit alongside the things they did that hurt you, not canceling each other out, just coexisting, the way Karen once told a different woman in a different story, in a kitchen I never sat in but somehow recognized completely. What I am most grateful for in the end is not the apology, though I am grateful for that too. It is my father. 38 years of a man who had learned to disappear inside his own house finally, at 63 years old, learning to show up, not because anyone demanded it of him in the moment that mattered most, but because a night on a bathroom floor taught him something 14 months of my quiet sacrifice had somehow never managed to teach anyone, including me. That love which only one person is required to carry is not sustainable, no matter how willingly that one person carries it. My name is Renee Castillo. My mother called me a burden at a table full of people who loved her, and 6 weeks later my father called me crying, asking to learn the thing none of us had ever asked him to learn. I do not know if I would have found my way to a healthier arrangement without that terrible night at Thanksgiving. I wish there had been a gentler door into it. But I have learned that sometimes the people who love us most only find the courage to change after the cost of not changing becomes impossible to look away from, and that you are not responsible for staying silent and absorbing harm just to spare someone that reckoning. If you are the one in your family who has quietly become the only person managing someone else's survival, say something out loud before it takes a bathroom floor at 1 a.m. for anyone else to understand what you have been carrying alone. That's the whole story. Thank you for staying with me through both parts. Subscribe for more stories like this one, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the next one.